Well, welcome back, everyone, to Worship God. My name is Rob Brockman. I'm the Associate Pastor at Cornerstone Baptist Church in Orillia, Ontario. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Jody Cross, who is the lead pastor at South Shore Bible Church in Barrie. Welcome back to the podcast. Jody, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Rob.
And today we're very excited. We're thrilled to welcome back to the podcast Brian Doerksen. Brian, for decades, has been a worship leader, pastor, songwriter, mentor, and you'll know many of Brian's songs like Come Now is the Time to Worship, Refiner's Fire, Hope of the Nations, one of my favorite. Brian's been on the podcast before. Brian, welcome back to the podcast, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Well, today we wanted to talk about the subject of suffering and the role that suffering can play in the life of a worship leader and a songwriter. A lot of us come with specific challenges and trials in our lives that we have to endure as we serve in ministry. And maybe it's a health issue, or maybe it's parenting issues for a season, or it's mental health issues. Suffering is part of the Christian life. In fact, often, unfortunately, but for our good, God uses suffering for our sanctification. I think of Romans 5, which says, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces character, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and on. Brian, we've all been going through a pandemic right now, and I'm curious about your experience during the pandemic, and maybe you can share a bit about what suffering the pandemic has brought along. What's that done in your life? What's changed? What's stayed the same? And what's likely to change for you on the other side of the pandemic?
Well, obviously, the pandemic has impacted all of us in both similar and diverse ways. Of course, I have very distinct memories of the first lockdown in March 2020, and I had 45 concerts booked throughout Europe and Canada. One of them, like a dream, like the dream of dreams. Like I was invited to the Royal Albert Hall in London, England, to perform with a 200-voice choir and a full orchestra, doing versions of Faithful One and several of my songs as part of an event called Prom Praise. Like, when I got the invitation, I was like, I'm looking at my wife, she's looking at me like, what just happened? What am I going to wear? Like, am I going to have to wear like a tux or what? Like, this is just so posh, and it's like, meanwhile, in Germany, there was a whole choir and orchestra preparing to arrange my Christmas album into a special Christmas concert at a cathedral just outside of, just right close to where the song Silent Night was actually written. Wow. So I had some of my dream concert gigs booked for 2020, all gone, right? So, I mean, as a musician and as somebody who gets part of the way I make a living and support my family through live events, you can, when we're talking about the subject of suffering, I mean, it's all relative, right? But it was like, okay, well, this wasn't planned. Okay, how are we going to, how am I going to put bread on the table? How are we, all of those factors just come flooding in. And yet, what I've found in the last couple of years is just gift after surprise of grace coming in the middle of the slowdown, in the middle of everybody, including sometimes ourselves, struggling with anxiety, struggling with how is this going to work? Slow down, take a deep breath, literally, metaphorically, trust God, love those around you, spend more time just enjoying the simple pleasures of life. We have hummingbirds here, and I was very diligent, in putting out my feeder, and now the Anna's hummingbirds winter actually here, and year round almost every single day, I step out the door of my house and I just marvel at these miraculous little birds that come and feed and visit. And I have a little sounds, that I make where they'll hover in front of the window when their feeder is getting empty. It's almost like, and they're looking for me, and I'm standing there, and I start clicking, mimicking some of their sounds, saying, "I see you. I'm going to refill that feeder for you." I don't know, like, so as hard as it's been, on the other side, or as we approach the other, as I see the end in sight, and people are I've started to book a couple of things and events and travel. There's part of me that goes, "Oh no, wait a minute." This has been so special. Our daughter and her husband moved back in with us because they didn't want to be isolated 30 minutes away, being forced into lockdown situations where they couldn't see us. So they sold their townhouse and moved in with us. And we share cooking, and it's like my dad, their grandpa, calls us the happy gang, like every time he comes over, he just hears so much laughter and so much interaction. So whatever happens on the other side, I don't want to lose that the togetherness.
Totally.
And all of the gifts that are around us in the natural created world that can bring us joy and can just fill us with energy to keep on going.
Yeah, you said beautifully there that even the difficult times, there are blessings that are inherent, and oftentimes you can see them if you look and you wait and you ask God for them. And I want to ask you, Brian, you have a couple of sons with Fragile X syndrome. They're now young adults, and I think they require some significant support. So tell us about your sons, and tell us how they have influenced you and shaped you and the music you create and what you do with your life.
My boys, Isaiah and Benjamin. Benjamin is 30. Isaiah's 22. This is a long story, which I'll try and make short, but especially after we had our first son and we found out he had Fragile X syndrome and would require care for the rest of his life, when we were expecting our last child, turned out to be our second son, we pleaded, we prayed, we fasted, we had people praying with us that we would have a son that would not be Fragile X. And to use the language of the Psalms, we prayed for deliverance from Fragile X syndrome, and we were not delivered. And that was heartbreaking. But over time, their essence, their essence that they exist, which means they are worthy of love, that they are worthy of care. And even though our sons can't contribute to the conversation, they can't do most jobs, they can help with certain things, they have some mobility, but that the fact is that their existence, and their existence that is worthy of love, has so permeated every part of our life. It slowed us down. We can't, we were explaining to somebody recently, here Joyce and I are in our mid-50s, and we can never leave our house without permission from somebody else. If our son is at home and we want to go somewhere without our son, like we have a weekly date night and we go out once a week for a quiet dinner and a walk. Well, we can't do that as mid-50-year-olds without asking for somebody's help. And, in our world's eyes, that's kind of like, well, that's kind of, too bad. Well, I guess you could say it's just normal for us, right? But their personalities, their affection has permeated I would say every one of my songs. Come, now's the time to worship. come, now's the time to give your heart, come just as you are, right? Like those lyrics are written because I've experienced suffering, challenge in an ongoing way. They weren't written triumphalistically. They were written honestly from the middle of my life. That's where the worship invitation comes, not into a pretending that it's all perfect, so to speak. And yet, in some ways, in its ordinariness, it is perfect. Like it is the life I have. I can't imagine any other life. So, I wrote songs like Your Faithfulness, I Don't Know What This Day Will Bring. I wrote that about the birth of our second son with Fragile X. Recently, I wrote a song called Everlasting Arms. We don't know when the storm is going to break, but underneath all things are the everlasting arms. I wrote that, out of the ongoing story of what we go through, and where is our trust? So grateful for my boys, and they impact every part of our life.
Yeah. I think some of our favorite songs are songs that are written out of places of suffering, right? Like the famous example is It Is Well. Like Horatio Spafford loses his little 4-year-old, and his entire life is ruined by the Chicago fire, and that song moves us because we can hear the realness behind those words. Even Jody, I was thinking about our lament song that we wrote last year with Pat that sprung from sufferings, inspired by Psalm 13 and 42 in the pandemic, but it's inspired by suffering. And I think sometimes I wonder if songwriters and pastors, if God intentionally maybe in his goodness and his grace puts us through a trial so that we can put pen to paper and give words for other people in their suffering. I'm thinking about 2 Corinthians 1 that talks about, God, when we suffer because God intends us to be comforted by him so that we could comfort others with the comfort that we've received. And it's kind of like a pass it along kind of thing. Brian, you released an EP, Everlasting Arms, you just mentioned it, and it contained 5 songs of comfort, especially recorded in the context of the pandemic. Maybe talk a bit about that EP and the writing of those songs. And how did the writing of those songs also impact how you were processing the pandemic?
Well, first of all, I think it was really, really important to, when the pandemic hit, is to stay engaged in our primary calling. Okay. So for me, songwriting, singing is part of that primary calling. And it's like, all of the opportunities to do this in person are gone. How can I pivot, whatever word you want to use, to say, I'm still going to engage in the heart of this activity. And shortly into that, I had a conversation with a dear friend named Cindy Rethmeyer, who is one of the early vineyard worship leaders from California. And she was describing a friend of hers who was struggling deeply with ongoing suffering, with health issues and stuff. And I can't remember who said it first, but we latched onto this phrase, in the middle, in the middle of this, of this suffering, of this uninvited suffering, your peace. So we wrote this song about this experience, and that was actually right at near the beginning of the whole pandemic lockdown, and it was so helpful to do. It was helpful to have something to work on, and it was helpful to try and gather up what we were all experiencing together and go, well, how would I express this in a song? This is hard. In the middle of this, there's a refrain in that song that goes, I may be feeling crushed and confused, right? That's the honesty of what a lot of people are feeling right now, crushed and confused. But I'm trusting, you're here with me. Like this sense of God's peace this is the most amazing thing, I think, about faith. and about our faith. I recently was chatting with an inmate who was just come out on parole, and I've seen him in the prison institution. I've gone in regularly and done concerts, and now I saw him on the other side, and he was recounting his coming to faith. There he was. He had committed a crime that he was guilty of. He was in the institution. He knew he deserved to be there. And then he had something worse happen in the institution, violence against him, and then falsely accused. He was put in solitary confinement. And it was in solitary confinement that one day several days into his solitary confinement, he's utterly broken. He wants to kill himself. There is no other solution. And he sees in his solitary cell a Bible, a Gideon's Bible. And he goes over and he picks it up, and he falls to somewhere in the gospel. He reads something. He falls to his knees and says, God, if you're real, I need you in this cell. And this peace comes to him when nobody else, every human around him is cruel. He knows he's there because he's guilty. And in that moment, God's peace. And this is the thing, so, that was kind of like, so we did in the middle, your peace. What else did we do in the EP? Oh, When You Shepherd Me, this is the 23rd Psalm, which I had written the setting of the 23rd Psalm years ago. And I thought, I'm going to bring that out. I did a new version of Everlasting Arms, which was from my Grateful album. I did, and Cindy, who co-wrote In the Middle, we updated Ever So Gently based on Psalm 19. The beautiful imagery of how the created world whispers the glory of God, the invitation of God. And then, what did I end with? Oh yeah, it's your faithfulness, which, I don't know what this day will bring, right? So it was just a real joy in the midst of the sadness of the pandemic to sing those songs and to trust that in the middle of it, God's peace was with us.
Yeah. Boy, that's a theme that everybody's needed, that sense of hope going on. God's in control. And thank you for that. Brian, you said you and your wife, I guess her name is Joyce, is that right?
Yep.
You've been married for how long?
37 years.
37 years. Congratulations. You started young, man.
Oh man, I did. We were both 19 when we got married, so it was a different world back then, I guess.
It was in the 90s. Did you is she musical?
No.
And so how does she walk this music journey, this family journey with you, and how does she inspire you to create?
Oh my goodness. Where do I start? She is earthy, she's intuitive, she's good at all the things that I'm not good at, but she loves me and loves my calling. And so we walk together. We talk about everything together. We not only do we have a weekly date night, but we have mini dates almost every day. I have one of my afternoon rituals over the last 10 years is making chai from scratch. And I grind the spices, and it takes me an hour. And then when it's done, I bring my wife a cup of hot chai, and we sit down and we process the day. And we ask each other about anything. How was your day? What's going on? What are you working on? And so if it's a song I'm working on, she knows about what I'm working on. She's not writing the song with me, but our lives are writing the songs together, if you know what I mean. Like we as parents of special needs children who are now adults, I mean, the divorce rate among special needs parents is terrible. It's like way higher than the general it's like 80%. And so, what we've tried to do when we talk about suffering is that we have both experienced suffering individually and together, but what we've tried to do is to say that this is meant to refine us and bring us together so that we're in even better partnership and a better team, you know. And I've turned down many music opportunities, tours, record deals, things that I was invited into that I said, I cannot accept this because of the cost it would be on my marriage, on my children. And so in the end, here I am. I'm still living in the same home that I was raised in. Joyce and I have been here for 20 some years, but I've been here in this house for over 50. And the roots go deep, relational roots, roots in place where I am, roots in faith, roots in tenderness towards each other, and I'm just beyond grateful. So I'm actually working on a few love songs right now to try and, because I think our world is filled with love songs that are about the start of relationships, about, you know, baby and infatuation and all of that. And I think we need more songs about old love, mature love, long love. And of course, God love, like that there's a source of love. And so we'll see. I don't even know what I'm going to do with them, but right now I'm really enjoying the process of writing those. And honestly, if it does, it keeps getting better.
I don't know if you caught what you said, but I wrote something down because it may be the title of your next love song. And maybe it already is. Maybe that's why it came out of your mouth. But if it's not, it's a contender. You said, our lives are writing the songs together. That sounds like the name of a beautiful song to me.
I've never said that before, so it just came out of my mouth. Hey, thanks.
You're welcome.
I'll have to,
so that's worth
a
maybe a
lyric.
little scratch pad. Our lives are writing the songs together. That sounds beautiful to me.
It does. Come on.
Man,
Anyway, there you go. That's tomorrow's job.
Okay, all right. Here we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Brian, we talked a bit about writing songs and suffering. I'm wondering if we could pivot for a second and just talk about leading worship and suffering. You know, I think a big criticism of a lot of what we see out there today in modern kind of contemporary worship is kind of happy clappy and disconnected from life's realities and pains. That's a criticism, at least. I don't necessarily say that's true of everything, but people will look at a lot of our worship and it's all, you know, it's all talking about the same thing. It's upbeat and it's not gritty. It's not real. How do we lead worship in a way that takes into account the suffering and the pains that people are enduring? What are some tips that maybe you have that have helped you, or that you have for leading people in worship in the midst of real life, you know, stuff?
Well, that's a great question and an observation I think that many of us are making, you know, as we go through these recent years. I mean, there's been a recent study done where you're also seeing the way songs are coming in and out of the church is accelerating. And so there's a whole bent towards what we need. It's almost like this excitement, entertainment mentality, right? So you're describing what we need is songs that are upbeat and exciting and energizing and everything. And yet the reality is real life isn't like that. It's much more ordinary and it's much more earthy, right? So, and the thing is, the songs we sing repeatedly form us or deform us, right? Like they either form our character in a good way or they deform us. They distort our character. And if the songs if our worship repertoire is, let's say, is all about power and greatness, it can prime us for what I would call a characterless Christianity, like because we think, okay, it's like magic, right? Like all we have to do is show up, sing this song about how great God is, sing it loud together, and almost like snap our fingers.
Yeah.
And all of our suffering and our issues will kind of evaporate.
Yeah, it's like you're blocking it out. Just don't think about how great God is, and just don't think about what you're going through.
Right. Well, so then you go, okay, then what about the songbook in the heart of the Bible, right? The Psalms. And you go, well, there was no blinkers or blinders being put on the worshipers then. It was like, how long, well, you guys have talked about it. How long, O Lord, will Psalm you forget 13. Me forever? Like, Psalm 13. Is it Psalm 42 that says, why are you so downcast?
Yeah.
And then it says this amazing phrase, for I will yet praise, right? Not now. Okay. My interpretation of that is like, to try and launch into a loud praise song in the middle of my traumatic suffering would be to do violence to my soul. Mm-hmm. No, I'm going to get there because of the character of God.
Yeah.
Right? But first, I have to express my struggle, my sadness, my grief. I have to go through, psychological, the 5 stages of grief. I have to go through all of those things in order to arrive at joy and praise on the other hand. So my plea to kind of pastors and worship leaders is how, ask yourself, how emotionally healthy is your repertoire? Right? Is emotional health is all of the emotions, including the difficult ones, represented in your repertoire like they are represented in the book of Psalms, the prayer book in the heart of the Bible. And let's bit by bit, let's start including more of those honest expressions, more diversity in tempo, diversity in key, diversity in style, diversity in content, because that leads to health. Yeah. And it also leads to people showing up at our congregations and going, oh, I'm not the only one struggling, right? With mental health issues or whatever. I'm not alone. And the great lie is this lie of shame, right? Whatever it is a person's going through, oh, it's just you. So you just hide yourself away, because you're defective. There's something wrong with you. No. Well, there's something, quote unquote, wrong with the human race. We have different language for it, sin, brokenness, but we are loved. Yeah. And we are welcome to come with our pain. I mean, if the Psalms didn't say it so clearly, I honestly, I think a lot of churches, their repertoire is basically sinning against the suffering. Because it's the upbeat praise songs on repeat. Yeah. And the suffering enter those congregations longing for resonance, longing for connection, longing to be seen and heard and loved, and leave feeling more beaten up.
Yeah. I once heard, I think it was John Piper said, every Sunday before me are people who are coming in like they've just come out of a funeral, and there's those before us who have just come out of a wedding, and probably the gamut in between. So I think we need to think about that. Yeah. Brian, in the midst of your own suffering, life happens in lots of different ways for all of us. Maybe as we just wrap up this, today, what are some practices in your life that you have employed, used personally to help you to keep holding on, to keep hopeful, to keep going when you've been through lots of times, your England journey, and I'm sure lots of times, after that as well. But just tell us about some things that will encourage us to keep going, to stay fresh, and to stay encouraged.
Well, let me start by saying something, a practice that I find has been incredibly helpful and incredibly simple. It's the practice of breath prayer. And as I've gone through different things and I feel anxiety rising in my heart, I've learned that if I just take some time and pay attention to my breath and infuse my breath with God, with awareness of God and love. For example, I remember I've done this a number of times, but this is pre-pandemic now. I'm flying somewhere to do an event, and there's a delay at the airport, and there's a huge security line, and I'm anxious because if I miss this flight, there's all of these terrible domino implications. And in my past life, I would just be fretting the whole time, and I'd be on my phone trying to fix it. Okay, I got to book another flight. And in recent years, I just felt like, God saying to me, slow down, Brian, breathe and trust me. And so I'd stand there for an hour as this line slowly moves through security, and I do my breath prayer. My phone stays in my pocket, and I would just, and with each breath, I would say the word Abba, like, just quietly, just there, just saying the word Abba. I almost start crying just right now. Just it's so, it doesn't matter where you are or what you're going through. You can reconnect with the source of love. And you can experience peace. So that would be one of the practices that has really anchored me. Walking, just every day, 2 or 3 times a day. Sometimes I call them prayer walks. Sometimes I just call them, stretch my legs walks, nature walks, whatever. I make sure I don't get to I don't know, I'm thinking of like we all are in our little spaces, and they can become like silos, with walls around us. So I need to get out into the openness and see and hear and breathe. And I can't tell you how many times I'm just walking, I'm just emptying whatever, and all of a sudden the thought, an inspired thought comes, a lyric idea or a scripture or something, and my spirit is lifted. And then it's another practice for me has been just that the relationships in my life are the most important things. So everything from the weekly date and the mini dates with my wife that you could say, well, that's not really a spiritual practice, and I would say, yes, it is. It is about oneness. Yeah. And then the way I stay grounded and anchored in a local faith community, that I don't keep, I stay connected. I stay known. I stay vulnerable. We talk about words like accountability. And primarily what that is just being in relationship enough that when somebody senses something's going off, they can come and say, are you doing okay? What's going on in this, because they know you enough. So those would just be some things that come to mind. And maybe lastly, I'll say, man, I tell you, singing. I whether we're talking about through the pandemic or through the last whatever, there's almost nothing that keeps somebody healthy as much as just singing your heart, singing while I walk, singing. I sing silly songs with my kids sometimes. I laugh. And all of those things are about being centered in love and, staying in that place of peace.
So much of what calms our anxiety is just reminding ourselves, like you're saying, Brian, about the truth of who God is. Just saying, you're my Abba, you're my Father, you're with me. That preaching to ourselves centers us. And brother, your songs for decades have done that. They've reminded us about who God is. And so, Brian, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Thank you for your faithful ministry and just all that you've done to serve the church over the years. Do you have a new project that you'd want to send people to go check out, something that you've released recently?
Well, the last full album I released is Hymns for Life, where I took many of the enduring songs of faith of the last several centuries, and I put my kind of unique spin on them. I wrote a couple of original refrains that just kind of naturally came while I kept on singing those hymns. And I get a chance to sing with my dad, which is so special on the project. He's 85, singing strong.
Amen.
His tenor. In fact, tonight, the day I'm talking with you guys about this, my dad and I are going into one of the local seniors' old folks' homes, and we are going to be singing for an hour together for all the residents there. So these hymns mean a lot to my dad's generation, and they mean a lot to me, and it was an incredible gift to sing them together. So yeah, you just go to briandoerksen.com. There's info about that project and all the little shenanigans that I keep getting up to, little creative ideas.
Yeah, that's great. Well, make sure, listeners, you go check that out. Brian, again, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast again. And listeners, make sure to check out our Facebook page, our Instagram, YouTube. We got clips there. And just search Worship God Podcast there. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.